Now, in Germany, they don't have two political parties like we have in the United States. We've had Republican and Democrats since 1856. Before that, for the most part, we've only had two parties. Third parties just haven't made much headway, but in Germany, at this time, they had 9 major political parties, and it was difficult for any one party to get a majority. So what they would do, the party that had what's called a plurality, in other words, the most, they would have to form a coalition with other parties, and that was the way they had to govern. So Hitler's Nazi Party was the most powerful party in Germany during the Depression years, but they never did have the majority. Nevertheless, Hitler felt he had an opportunity to seize power. So rather than do like he had done in a beer hall putsch and seize power illegally, he got his power legally. Now, there's a book that my brother-in-law gave me that I have at home that talks about it. Said it was unlike any revolution that had ever occurred in the history of mankind. The book's title is Defying Hitler, and regrettably I can't think of the author's name right now, but anyway, Defying Hitler is the name of the book. And he said, unlike other revolutions, in the real revolution, you have the establishment. And when the people outside revolt, the establishment comes in with armies, and there's a struggle, there's a fight, and sometimes the establishment wins and sometimes they lose, but at least there's a struggle. With this revolution, you had the establishment, you had the people outside revolt, but there was no struggle, there was no fight. They just simply came in and took over. And everybody thought that, hey, the next person will stand up to him. Nobody did. Sebastian Haffner was the man's name, by the way. But he described it that, he said, we Germans, he was a German, we have to explain to our children why we let this happen in Germany. He said, the best explanation I can give to my children, the best explanation Germany can give is, we all thought they'll stand up to Hitler. But when it came their turn, they backed down. Everybody backed down. And just simply let him take in and take the reins. It's difficult, folk, to understand how Hitler could gain the type of control he did. There was a book written that I read when I was in high school entitled The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and they would ask this question more than once: how did he do it? Part of how he did it can be explained by the fact that the German people were told, whatever you do, always obey your authority, the person over you. Children, always obey your dad. Wives, always obey your husbands. In the army, always obey your superior officer. It has been said that the typical German soldier, he had no lack of courage when facing his enemy. He could fight his enemy, but he would cower to his man in charge of him. Many a German soldier found himself standing up stiff before a firing squad because he tried to question the man ahead of him. Because of the threat of a firing squad was real, even for generals. Even German generals sometimes faced a firing squad. You learn just simply obey orders without question, just do it. And later, during the Nuremberg trials, some of them said, we did what we were told to do, we just obeyed orders. Well, what if they order you to gas a bunch of humans in a gas chamber or land them up in front of fire and shoot them all dead? Well, that's what we did. We just simply did what they told us to do. They had this thinking that you always obey his orders, and even preachers would say the same thing. Now, one particular prominent preacher comes to mind, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. Maybe I've heard of him, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But he would preach between the wars two things: pacifism, always seek peace, and always obey the person in authority. Then one day Adolf Hitler became the person in authority. And he wound up reversing to saying sometimes war is necessary and sometimes it's necessary to disobey. Within hours before the war ended, they hung Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He rebelled, or he was accused of rebelling against Adolf Hitler, something he had preached against, but then he finally admitted there are certain times when you do disobey the superiors and certain times when you do rebel, and certain conditions when war is the only alternative. But in Germany, They had a mindset. Don't disobey, don't question your authority, just simply do it. Now, folks, this might get more into psychology than, well, history does involve psychology. But one man said, I met Adolf Hitler in the early 1920s, before he was powerful. He said, I met him and I looked into his eyes. And what I saw in his eyes let me know this man is going to go to the top. What could he see in his eyes? A lot of determination, a lot of forcefulness, and also a lot of fear that he could inspire in anybody who stood against him. Anyway, he became the leader of the most powerful party in Germany, and he went from there to persuading Germany's President von Hindenburg, and von Hindenburg was by this time suffering from what they at that time called old age senility. Today we might call it Alzheimer's, but von Hindenburg's mind was going bad. Von Hindenburg gave Hitler the title he wanted, again, all legally. Then Hitler went before the German Congress, the Reichstag, and asked the Congress to give him total powers to rule as he pleased by decree. Some members of the Reichstag who opposed it were whipped. I mean, can you imagine our president whipping some members of Congress or a senator? I mean, you know, but this is basically what happened in Germany. And nobody stood up to him and nobody said no. Hitler wound up, he had all the power he needed, and he controlled the press, the radio, the churches, the schools, the education all the way from kindergarten through graduate school. He controlled it all. He once boasted, probably no one will ever have more power than I have, and it was by no means a hollow boast. Again, it was all done legally by constitutional means, and folk, for the most part, and this is hard to understand, but the German people did not have a tradition of democracy, not like we do in the United States. For the most part, it had the approval of the majority of the German people. The German people, of course, were somewhat torn. I mean, they had been told all along during World War I that they were winning. I mean, the propaganda, the radio, and they didn't have radio but in World War I, but their newspapers were telling them every day, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. And of course, there was a day when Russia pulled out of the war, and the Germans told them, well, the Russia's out of the war, we're going to concentrate now on fighting on the Western Front, but we're winning the war. And all of a sudden, they were told one day, Germany has surrendered, we've lost. And I can't imagine, I mean, I had a student do a paper on that topic one time. I can't imagine what that would have been like, but it was a terrible blow to them. But Hitler began to fill the Germans with what you might call strange beliefs. He'd get up and say, no, we are the master race. We are the superior people, the better people. But then again, you might ask, well, if we're the best, how come we lost the last war? We didn't lose the last war. We were stabbed in the back by Jews. We were stabbed in the back by communists. They cost us the war. We did not lose. I mean, believe me, if I put the volume that I know Hitler used, there'd be a security guard coming into the room wondering what's going on. Because, I mean, he could scream, he could holler. And he was heard by Americans. Again, I gave this same lecture yesterday. How many of you know anything about shortwave radio? 40 years ago, and even 50 and 60 years ago, most of the world's listening was done with shortwave radio. We Americans don't do it, but basically shortwave radio can go across the ocean, send radio signals. And a lot of Americans in the 1930s had shortwave receivers. They were attached, they didn't have FM then, but they would attach shortwave to a regular AM radio player. And they would sit there with the old tubes that were humming along, and they'd have an antenna where they could grip the antenna and use their bodies as an antenna. Again, do any of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, use their bodies as an antenna, and they could pick up Hitler's speech. But unlike the Germans who were swayed by it, Americans got the impression that here is an insecure man. Here is a man who really feels weak, very weak, but who's trying to use his position to make up for his lack of personal strength. The Americans could sense that about him, and the Americans were not swayed. Again, he spoke German, and most Americans could not understand the language, but they could pick up on the tone. And maybe it's a good thing they couldn't understand the language, but they did understand the tone. Now, I must state, folk, this thing about superior race and master race was not just taught by Hitler in Germany. I went to UT in 1971, and I had an old professor, Dr. Harold Fink by name, who was using a textbook that was written in the 1930s. And by the way, he was criticized for it. They were criticized for using textbooks that old. But this book he used was 40 years old. And it gave me the impression that they were teaching racial superiority in colleges in the United States in the 1930s. Talking about how during the fall of the Roman Empire, the Germans came into Europe and they infused new blood into the European racial scene. And they brought in better blood, basically white, blonde, white, and blue-eyed. Now, Hitler believed that the blue-eyed blondes were the superior race, and someone yesterday pointed out Adolf Hitler was neither blue-eyed nor did he have blonde hair. I said, yeah, this was one of the enigmas of the whole scenario. But Hitler envisioned putting together a super race. He got his idea from Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who said that they could create a race of Superman, and some people believe that the Superman comic came from him. Now, if you ever seen the Superman comic, which you remember movie, Superman has the ideal body built like a Greek god. Very, very broad shoulders, big bulging biceps, and a slender waist. He believed that they could build a society where all of the men would have that type of figure, a Superman type figure, the figure of a Greek god, and all the women would have perfect figures and would be extremely attractive. It's an ideal, folk, that we now know is virtually impossible to achieve. But Hitler believed that he could. Basically, he could create a super race by, I've told you before, eliminating the inferior races, and thereby only letting the better people grow or reproduce. And by so doing, promote mankind to the next higher level of evolution, where that we'd all be supermen and all be have super bodies and super good looks. Again, totally impossible. But Superman himself, the comic, started in 1936 and may have been influenced by Hitler's ideal. I mean, this idea, folks, I must tell you, it may have started in Germany, infiltrated, and got high up in American society also, along with the idea of anti-Semitism. A lot of persons won't admit it, but a lot of Americans at the time were also anti-Semitic, anti-black, and pro-Nordic. They called it Nordic. Nordic meant Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Norwegian, Scandinavian, white, and blonde. And if this makes you feel uncomfortable to talk about this, I mean, it makes me feel uncomfortable too. But I mean, it must be said because it became a really big part of the world history at the time. All right. There's a story that's, I mean, this is very famous, and if you haven't heard it, you probably will at some point. Some man got up and gave a speech, and after, because the speech was not tape recorded, and they had tape recorded, this speech was not recorded, nobody transcribed it, and even he later said, I can't tell you exactly how it went, except he said, I know the first part was right, but the speech went something like this. He said, I was living in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. First, they came after the Jews. I was not a Jew. I did not protest. Next, they came after the communists. I was not a communist. I did not protest. Next, they came after the trade unionist. I was not a trade unionist. I did not protest. Next, they came after the Masons. Well, being a Catholic, I was not a Mason. I did not protest. Then they came after the Gypsies. I was not a Gypsy. I did not protest. Next, they came after me, and nobody protested. Have any of you had a chance to hear this? One of you. Yeah, like I say, if you haven't heard it, you probably will from time to time. Every once in a while, some politician will get up and recite it, or it might find its way in the newspapers. The speech, again, went something like that. The first part of it, though, everybody said they knew was right. When he said, first they came after the Jews. I was not a Jew, I did not protest. After that, nobody knew for sure which group he was talking about, but he named several groups. But the end of the punchline was, next they came after me. And there was nobody around to protest. All right. Hitler began to put the German people back to work. And now, okay, I've got to be careful what I say about Lockheed, but I will say this much. They managed to keep their trade secrets by having a group over here who put together a part of the project, particularly composites. But these people just told, mix up this, and then they would pass it on to some people hundreds of miles away, and they'd mix up that. Then it'd pass on to some people hundreds of more miles away, and mix up, but nobody exactly knew what they were doing. Eventually, what would come out would be a composite. But nobody knew how it was put together except for one or two people. Well, in the Germans, they were doing the same thing. They were making parts at this factory, and the parts were going to be assembled at some other factory several miles away. Well, this young man got married one day and found out his wife was going to have a baby, and he was told, you go work at this baby carriage factory. He thought, hey, I know, I'm going to give you a free baby carriage, this baby carriage factory, but the carriage was not assembled where he worked. He said, I'll steal the end products of each department every day and slip them home under my clothes or under my coat, whatever. So he slipped the end products of each department home, assembled the parts, but he had not a baby carriage, but a machine gun. There were stories like this whispered in Germany that German people had a reason to be a little bit uneasy. Hey, just what is happening to us? Again, Hitler, like Mussolini, sent the women home to bear children, at least most of them, and that helped get the men employed. And then the men who still couldn't find work, they were all drafted into the army. Same thing Mussolini had done, and that made it seem like that they had solved the unemployment problem. Germany was completely out of its depression by 1936. And in America, in 1936, we still had some of the worst of our depression ahead of us. Time magazine, and folks, I've had a student do a paper on this, and this is documented. Time magazine named Adolf Hitler Man of the Year in 1930. They put his picture, bold, front page of the paper. Now, they did talk about his anti-Semitism somewhere back on page 48 somewhere, one little small article, unnoticed, small print, about his anti-Semitism, about his racism. They didn't emphasize, but at least they mentioned it. You had to find it. But in the front pages was all the great things he had achieved. He had transformed Germany, put all the Germans back to work. Germany was out of depression. The Germans were all, their mortgages were now up to date. Their loans were up to date, and everybody was working. That was quite a great, wonderful man, you know. In the meantime, we kept our democracy. We also kept our depression for a while, but at least we kept our democracy. In the long run, guess who wound up winning out? But at least Hitler made it seem like he had solved his country's problems. No, really, his country's problems were about to begin. Your book shows a picture of a very, very massive rally there on page 730. Again, it would have been impossible for Hitler to address these people without the invention of public address systems that had been invented decades before. Something else Hitler did that was extremely dangerous and reminds me of something that a Roman general had done back in Roman times. All right, now, I once joined the army. When I did, I put one hand on the Bible and raised my other hand toward heaven and swore with an oath to my United States, to the country. I did not swear to President Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time. I'm giving you some idea how old I am. But no, I did not swear an oath of loyalty to Jimmy Carter. But Hitler made the people who were joining army swear not to Germany, but to him, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, I am willing and ready to give up my life for him. I will devote all my energy and strength to the savior of our country, so help me God. That was the oath they took when they joined their army. An oath. Now, again, a Roman general had done this a generation before, and it was very devastating to the Roman Republic. In fact, helped destroy the Roman Republic. This general said to his troops, you swear an oath of loyalty to me, Fury on the Roman Republic. Again, very dangerous. When he took over the churches, even some atheists were a little bit upset because they said, hey, the church is the means by which a dictator's power is at least somewhat held in check. And when even the preachers were afraid to speak out against him, this, again, created fear in the minds of many. Now, in the case of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his brother-in-law happened to be working up high in Hitler's bureaucracy and got hold of Hitler's plan. Hitler, of course, we all know he planned to get rid of the Jews. His next plan after that was to get rid of the Christians. This is not as widely published, but the problem with the Christians were there were too many of them at the time, and he could not just eradicate them all. But his plan, and again, we have a museum here in Marietta that says the same thing, but you can verify it and research. His plan was to return Germany to the worship of the old gods, the gods they'd abandoned, Thor and Odin, Frigga, Tyr, Loki. I mean, you might have seen these gods on some of the recent movies that have come out, the gods of Asgard. But his plan was to replace Christianity with the worship of these old pagan gods once again. At least that's what he said his plan was. And Christians, once the Jews were all done away with, the Christians were next on his sights, and the ones who didn't conform he was going to eliminate.